If you prefer to join the conference audio using telephone, please click Telephone in the audio portion of the control panel and your dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing questions and comments to the questions portion of the control panel. Please submit your questions and comments anytime during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during a Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. I would like to introduce today's presenters. Craig Laubacher, VP Validation Engineering at CSACE Alliance, and Michael Heaps, Manager Channels and Validation Services at IQS Incorporated. Craig, we'll turn it over to you first.
Okay, thank you very much, Josh. I really appreciate it. First of all, I just want to kind of go over some goals of today's presentation so that we're all pretty clear about what we're trying to accomplish here. The first thing that we're going to talk about in today's presentation is what does this risk-based approach really mean? We hear it bantered about all the time in industry. We probably talk about it in our own facilities and companies, but we're going to go over a little more detail than maybe you've seen in the past. The second one is, how does this actually save me money and time? Again, it's something that you hear, yeah, that's a good conversation piece. Yeah, it saves a lot of money and time, but really, what are the aspects of this process that actually save that money and that time for you? Then we're going to go over a couple of success stories that we've actually seen in the industry, and then following that, we'll have just a brief question-and-answer session. So it shouldn't take up too much of your time, but hopefully we can accomplish these things for you. Another thing I wanted to mention is that we're going to kind of go over what we've been seeing in industry the most recently. I know that's on a lot of your mind, trying to stay fresh with the most recent industry thinking, different waves of the future kind of coming into the present now with this risk management techniques. And that's just something that we're going to try to be presenting in a series of webinars, and this being the first. Okay, so what is our challenge? What are we faced with when looking at a big enterprise-wide software validation project? Of course, you have this nebulous business need that kind of floats over everything going on. Then you have this complex software package that you may or may not have already chosen. And then you've got your SOPs and your guiding documents from whatever regulated body that governs you that kind of tells you what you're supposed to accomplish roughly. And then hopefully maybe there's a risk assessment process that maybe you mentioned in some of your SOPs. You know you've seen them in all the guidance documents recently. And then you know at the end of it all, you're going to have volumes and volumes of validation documents, right? So that's what everybody kind of expects to see. But how do we untwist some of these interactions? And that's what we're going to go over today and show you how to maybe streamline this, make this be really effective for you and your organization, and really get down to the meat of what you need to know. Okay, so before we get started, we're actually going to have a couple of survey questions sprinkled throughout this presentation in order to get your feedback so we can get to know you a little bit better in what you're being faced with in today's world. So the first one we have here, in your opinion, what do you think are some of the major challenges that you're faced with when trying to adopt this risk-based approach to your enterprise-level CSV? So when filling out this poll question, you can select as many answers as you find applicable. You just go ahead and click them, and we'll leave this open for a few seconds here to kind of gain some of your information.
Thank you, Craig. So as mentioned, please select as many poll responses you find appropriate. Remember to click the submit button down below. We'll leave the poll open for just a few more seconds now. We have about half of our votes in so far.
All right, excellent. Let's give it another couple seconds, and then I'll go ahead and read off what we think here. Okay, so it looks like the majority of us think that lack of experience with risk management techniques might be one of the causes of challenges to the actual implementation, as well as maybe you're going to increase some exposure to risk. Those are really good concerns. Obviously, the lack of experience is going to be a limiting factor in implementing something. But hopefully, if you kind of keep these four in mind here as we go through, maybe we can kind of clarify some things for you and kind of make this be a little bit easier down the road. And of course, if you have any follow-up questions, you can always pose those throughout the presentation. And then if we want to get into more detail, we can always answer those offline. So thank you very much for that. All right, So what does this approach really mean? Now, I'm not going to get into a ton of detail about this, but I'm going to give you some concrete process steps and some good baseline approach guidelines that you need to take into this particular approach when dealing with a big enterprise level CSV. So in a nutshell, you guys have probably seen similar maps to this, but we're going to be talking about the first 4 steps of this particular process. So we're going to talk about process mapping, the touch point analysis, our risk assessment process, and then analyzing our mitigation. We're not going to get into the validation protocol development, protocol execution in this particular presentation, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so overall, what type of approach is this? Well, traditionally, in the world of software validation, most companies adopted what could be considered a software-centric approach. What that means is they start with the software and they work outward. So, for instance, they buy a big piece of software and they go to module number 1 and they open up screen number 1 and they just start clicking through trying to determine maybe what's critical in that particular screen. Maybe they just decide they're going to list all those functions as requirements and do all the typical testing. Well, that is not the approach that we're advocating here. What we're calling this a process-centric approach. So we're opening our eyes to the business process at hand. And we'll get into some details about what that actually means. But we've kind of standardized this approach, and what we've seen in industry lately is a standardized approach with ICHQ 9, GAMP5, and then we also have borrowed some ISO 14971 standards as well from a medical device perspective. So step number 1, I like to say you put the pre in preparation. You need to prepare for risk management. So you need to develop a strong SOP, a risk management plan with specific tables with regards to your severity, probability, detectability, and acceptability of your RPN, your risk priority numbers. You need to train your workforce on these techniques and preferably select a strong and experienced facilitator to kind of keep everybody on track. Okay, and then number 2. Now this is where the rubber meets the road here. So we need to develop business process maps. So that's kind of 2A. So what that means is, okay, what are we doing here? Well, what we have realized is that the software is not really the most important thing here. The most important thing is to identify what your business process needs are. What does your business actually do? So you have a start to a process. In this particular, just a short little example here, we have production planning. And this is the analyst's particular role. And so what do they have to do? Well, we need to load a new forecast. We have to delete the weekly forecast, update our safety stock, load reorder point, load MQQ. Okay, so those are what the analyst needs to do. So what we've decided to do is list all of the different roles in these swim lanes, as well as on the bottom here you see Pro is our software name. Down below we've identified where the software actually interacts with that process. So it can be input, calculations, transfer of data, reports and outputs, those types of things. So the software is just a part of this process. So the software is not the whole process. It is a key component of that process. So what we do then when we analyze all these, we circle those or identify them somehow, and then list each one of those particular use cases or user requirements, forecast load from CSV, delete weekly forecast, item site planning and maintenance. You highlight those and list those in what we call a user requirements document. Okay, so we're going to pause here for a question. Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Actually, we do have a question that's been asked, and it's interesting because it's one that we've seen before and we get asked quite a lot when we start the projects. And the question is this: how do we determine what information is going to be addressed? Where do we start?
That is a really good question. So the reason why we kind of paused at this step, the last thing that we just talked about was identifying which particular use cases within the software were critical based on these process maps. So the first thing that we need to do then is actually itemize those user requirements within the risk assessment table. So those are going to be in our left column, if you can picture that. I don't have a sample risk assessment in here, but if you can just picture those use cases listed down the left side, and we take each one of those user requirements then, and we put them through the ringer, is what we call it, which means we try to identify any way that those particular records, because that's what we're dealing here with, those records can somehow fail, right? Whether it's lack of integrity or inaccurate calculations or inaccurate reports or mistransfer of data. There's a multitude of different ways, but there's a standard approach that you can put these particular use cases through the ringer, okay? So then you kind of analyze each one of these scenarios, and if you want to, you can give it a pre-mitigation ranking. But then one of the most important things that we're going to talk about all day today is this next step, the fourth bullet here, that says identify all mitigation. So those are methods of control. And those can be in many different forms. SOPs, preventive maintenance perhaps, training, security functionality of your software, change control. But the key one here is really our software functionality. So we list as a method of control for these risks everything that our software does to protect or ensure accuracy or detect failures of these records. So these mitigations can come in many different shapes and sizes, but this is one of the most important parts of this entire process, okay? So keys to success, ensure that these are testable items, because I'll show you why here in just one second. So after you get done listing all those mitigations with your multifaceted team, you rank these risks post-mitigation according to those predetermined risk ranking tables that we discussed up there in the risk management plan development. Okay, so the fourth step, the final step of this risk-based approach that we're talking about right now, is if you determine if all the risks are acceptable. So you calculated those RPNs, the risk priority number. You just multiply your severity times your probability times your detectability. You guys have probably always seen that before. And you determine if it's acceptable according to the predefined number, whether it's unacceptable, needs improvement, or A-OK, right? So you already set up those tables, and now you rank all those risks, and you determine if you have any red, yellows, and green. Now, if you have anything that's in the red zone, meaning, well, we probably have a little bit more risk than we're comfortable with for that particular scenario, then you kind of say, okay, well, we probably need to increase, maybe there's additional mitigations that we have to design in, maybe we need to do some more training, maybe we need to add an audit trail to that particular record. You know, there's all kinds of things that you can do to decrease that risk, right? So then all these mitigations, so this right here, if you think of anything else in this whole presentation, this one line right here, all of your mitigations then become your testable requirement. So everything that you just listed to lower the risk ranking become what you need to test in your validation test. So that the only things that are going to be listed here, as you know, because we just came from above, which was the critical business processes, are going to be considered critical. Okay, so just in recap of this process, we're defining what needs to be tested, we're determining if we have any out-of-range risks, and we're determining if we have any design gaps. So to me, that sounds like a pretty successful risk-based approach right here. So now that you kind of see, in essence, what the approach is, we have one more survey question here to ask you. So assuming that your organization did adopt this risk-based approach or a similar one to enterprise-level CSB, what benefits would you as a company realize? So we'll go ahead and open up this poll in the same manner. Go ahead and just read through these, reduce cycle time of software implementation, reduce long-term costs. Read through these and try to identify all the ones that you think are applicable.
Thank you, Craig. And again, attendees, you can select more than one appropriate answer. Remember to click the Submit button down below to finalize your answer. And we have about half of our answers so far, so please go ahead and submit your response now. We'll close the polling question in about 10 more seconds.
Yeah, this is great. So just in recap, you know, we were talking about saving time and money, but it's really neat to see. So these other particular benefits that you can experience. So now that the poll is closed, it looks like to identify potential gaps within the current quality system is the #1 side benefit that you guys have identified, which is really insightful, actually, because I would totally agree with you. Now, of course, reducing the cycle time of software implementation is #2, closely behind, and that is obviously why we're all here, because we want to save money and time. But that alternative benefit, which we'll describe a little bit more below, is something that's really critical as well. Okay. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. So let's go over the benefits. How does this save me time and money? So number one, let's just get into the meat of it, reduce time of implementation. So how does this actually benefit me? Well, after going through that process a little bit, it's pretty clear. It limits the effort to what's actually important to your critical business process. Because we took this process down approach, we filter out the noise before we even get started. So we never talk about the stuff that's not critical. We never deal with that from a quality validation perspective. We only concentrate on the things that are critical. And the second one here, which is almost as important, possibly more important, is we're identifying the gaps within the software in our quality system prior to test execution, not after test execution. So obviously that is a big time saver. And the third one here, kind of related to number two there, is reducing the number of non-conformities to save significant time on your go live. When everybody here knows when a discrepancy, if it's caught up front compared to wait until you actually execute the test, we're talking like a 10x time saving. All right, then number two here is a direct reduction in implementation cost. Now, in this case, time and costs are probably as related as you can possibly get. Time may have some additional benefits in that you're going live earlier, but the direct reduction in implementation cost meaning that we're only challenging our critical items during our validation testing, and we're avoiding these major implementation pitfalls. Now, it's not just validation implementation pitfalls. Now, we want to keep in mind, we're also, since we're doing this really nice process approach and bringing everybody into the table, we're going to identify what potentially had not been thought about with the implementation team. So we're actually bringing a quality eye to the implementation team to ensure that they've thought of everything that they may have not thought of if they thought they did beforehand. Okay, and then number three, this is a really interesting one. And this is something that we've only, we didn't know we were going to recognize as a benefit until we started doing this over and over again. So implementation buy-in. So what this means is we're talking about throughout your enterprise, throughout your company. If anybody has ever gone through a major software implementation, which I assume most of you guys have on some level, you know that there is resistance to change. People pretty much despise it. And the people that are involved in the implementation, of course, that's all they eat, drink, breathe for months on end. Well, what this process does is it gets everybody pointing in the same direction. It allows everybody to see the benefit of why we're doing the software implementation. It allows everybody to see the benefits of the validation process, which, as we all probably know, people don't usually look at the validation people to bring light to their day. But it really decreases this resistance to this change due to this multidisciplinary involvement of everybody within the company, the leaders within the company especially. So all these different disciplines need to be involved in this process, and we have seen remarkable differences of implementation buy-in. And then number four, the last one we're going to talk about, is reduced long-term testing requirement. So most of you are all familiar with change control testing. So there's going to be your standard change control testing of your ERP, but then there's this whole validation and quality aspect to change control testing on a regular basis. And what this does is it limits those functions that will be changed to a specific step. So if you do anything that can edit any of these particular records within your ERP, then you're going to have to go through change control, your formalized change control. If potentially you have some changes to records that are not considered critical or functions that are considered minor, not critical, things that were not identified here, you may be able to do a much quicker change control down the road, not have all this big giant quality buy-in down the road. Now, I mean, once you get your change control set up, that is something that you really look into, and you can see it can save tons of time and money down the road. So we're going to get into two short success stories before we wrap up here. And so I'm going to hand it over to Mike Heaps to kind of set it up and explain to you the circumstance.
Okay, great. Thanks, Craig. So this first success story, we had a project that was initially set up to provide services to perform a software validation of a warehouse management system called Red Prairie. Using process mapping and risk assessment techniques that Craig's just been talking us through, In this particular project, we were able to identify several key risks that needed to be mitigated and which led the company then to make some important business decisions about what they were doing and how they were doing it. So it was fairly critical in actual fact. And Craig, maybe you could give some more details around what we found and the decisions that the company made.
Thanks, Mike. This was one of the most interesting projects we'd ever been involved in, Mike's company and ours. We went into this project with the client with the request of just doing this regular old validation, right? Validate our warehouse management system. Sounds simple enough. So we went through the process just like Mike described. But what we found out right after the process mapping and as soon as we went into the risk assessment process, we started seeing a lot of red on the page. We started seeing a lot of processes were not clamped down near as well as they needed to be. There were some issues with their FIFO, warehouse management control. Things weren't being a lot traceable as well as they thought they were. We had some issues. And so instead of jumping right into the validation testing, which a typical approach would have done, instead what we did was bring it up to management and say, okay, here's what we got. Here's our situation. We have this many systems or this many processes within this system that aren't really working so well. We have gaps that really need remediation before we can go into the actual validation process. Because why would we go into validation if we're going to be not compliant anyway, right? It's just going to be wasting your money. So they decided to cancel the validation project because of what we brought to light during this process and decided to wait until the upgrade occurred to a totally new system where they're going to do this entire process again before they actually do compliance and validation activities. So from a validation guy standpoint, you might think, wow, that really didn't work out like you wanted it to, did it? And maybe not, it wasn't on the top of our head that that's what was going to happen, but we provided the client a ton of value. They feel wonderful about the fact that we at least know what we're dealing with now. And so that's, those are some of the alternate benefits that you guys actually called out in that poll question, that we have some gaps in our quality system that need to be addressed before we can even get into the validation. So that's fantastic. It was a really neat story. Okay, and let's go into number 2 here then, Mike.
Yeah, okay. Now, the second example comes from a project that we recently completed with an organization, and they had actually already used our services to perform a validation of their ERP system. But they were going through some major changes taking place. Number one, they had decided to move their IT operations to an off-site location and were installing new hardware for that ERP system to run on. And secondly, they were also bringing in a new division of the company to use the same ERP system. So they asked us if we would help them again, and the process was slightly different here. With the new hardware and the reinstallation of the software, we needed to revisit the installation qualification, and with the introduction of the new division, we needed to revisit also the process mapping and the risk assessment phases to make sure that any new user requirements were accounted for. So one more thing that gave us something of a challenge here with this project is it all had to be done within a specific time frame. So Craig, if you can run us through a little bit about what happened on this and what the time frame was and how we approached it.
Sure, great, thanks, Mike. That was a really good description. And another one of the softer sides of things here is this particular organization has had trouble gaining buy-in, like I keep using that word, gaining buy-in from all their different parts of their organization for these major changes in the past. And they had noticed that that's been an issue. So they were a little bit skeptical about how this was going to work in their particular facility. Well, like Mike had said, we'd already done the validation of the software at another location, but we're going to be moving all their data, moving all the processes, reanalyzing their entire workflow process. And so they had set a budget that was actually fairly tight to begin with. But we went through this process mapping, and we decided and determined that there was a lot more similarities than they thought that they had. And they invited all the key people to these meetings, and everybody was really attentive. They truly owned this process internally and they drove it themselves almost, and it was fantastic. So at the end of it, they made a couple of minor changes to their internal processes, the implementation of the process. So the software has a typical implementation cycle, and we were given a 1-month post-implementation due date to complete all of the validation activities. And as you guys probably know, that is really tight when you're talking about a major enterprise resource planning software system. So what we did, we were able to identify, first of all, we cut down the number of requirements that required testing, because it turns out there was significant less critical usage of the software than they thought that they were going to do, because most of it was handled manually or through other systems. So we're able to really cut down the critical functions due to our process mapping, and we were actually able to finalize the last test, final approval, 3 weeks after the final implementation date. 3 weeks. So we did a lot of concurrent testing during implementation to be able to crunch that down to 3 weeks, which is really amazing, really. And our final total came in actually 40% under budget from what they were expecting to spend. So those two numbers in and of themselves made everybody very, very happy. So that kind of concludes the last success story here. So before we get into some of answering some questions, I just want to kind of recap what we've talked about as far as the goals go. So what does this risk-based approach really mean in terms of actually validating a big software system? And we went through those steps. The second one is, how does this save me money and time, as well as other benefits, right, that you guys even called out in that polling question? And then a couple of success stories. So what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Mike to go ahead and present or go through some of the questions that you guys have been presenting as the presentation's gone on. And feel free to continue to submit new questions for us to go over the next few minutes as well.
Okay, great. Well, Craig, we do actually have a couple of questions that have been asked as we've gone through. The first question is, what type of software will work with this kind of process?
Okay, so that's a really good question, yeah, because we're being really generic and when we're just saying kind of enterprise level systems or ERPs. So ERP is a specific type of software that controls a lot of business processes, but that's really too specific of a term. Enterprise is what we're talking about here, meaning it could be your QMS, your quality management system, your laboratory information management system, so your LIMS, your clinical trial management systems, content management, electronic data capture. From the manufacturing side, it can be your MES, your manufacturing execution systems. So any one of those types and many more fit this model really, really well. Because what you see when you go out and try to purchase one of these pieces of software is that it has a million different functions. It's got unlimited modules almost. And when you're buying it, you're usually looking at it to satisfy this need or this need, or these 2 or 3 things. Not everything that it can do under the sun. So it's any kind of software that you don't use all its capabilities fit this process perfectly. So that you analyze your process. You say, software, you're under my control. I tell you what you need to do for me. You don't tell me what I need to do. So any of those types usually works extremely well.
Okay, great. We do have just one more question right now. So people, if you do want to ask a question, please feel free to type it in. This next question, Craig, it's another interesting one. It's actually a little bit related to the one you just asked, but the question is, how do we approach SaaS software systems?
Okay, so SaaS software systems, that is a very interesting question because we were going to bring this up a little bit later on here. So SaaS is software as a service, if you guys haven't heard that. So it's typically software that is hosted elsewhere, controlled by a third-party vendor, and many times even your data then would be housed elsewhere. So maybe you can consider that computing on the cloud, right? So there's a lot of different topics that are kind of related to the software as a service topic. Now, before I get into an entire webinar on that, I actually want to make note that our next webinar actually is addressing this exact topic. we're actually, next in our series of topics is actually addressing some of the pitfalls and some of the ways to make staff implementation successful. Because this question is so relevant in today's society, it's really impossible to see the world going backwards and staying all with local implementations and hard software packages right there on your facility grounds. And we know that every software supplier is moving this way, but there are some key things to keep in mind when selecting these service providers. Not every one of them is going to lead you to the promised land from a compliance standpoint. There are certain pitfalls that you really have to look out for. And we will definitely go over those in our next webinar. I mean, there's a number of things to talk about, and that's why it's going to be an entire session. But yeah, be looking out for that particular invite coming very soon.
Okay, great. Thanks, Greg. That actually is all of the questions that came through. If anyone does have a question, feel free to type it in again now. I'll give you a few seconds to pose those.
Thank you, gentlemen. And again, to our attendees, you can type in your questions using the questions panel at the right-hand side of your screen. Please submit any additional questions and comments that you may have now. Greg, I wanted to give you a chance to give our attendees maybe some final thoughts or recommendations before we move to close.
Sure, not a problem. First of all, I just would like to say thank you so much for attending today. We really appreciate your time. I know it's extremely valuable. In looking at implementing this type of approach, I just want everybody to kind of think about what it takes to prepare for it. It's not something to jump right into with no forethought. Putting the pre in preparation is one of the most important facets of this, but it's doable. And that's the other thing I want to let you know. It is doable. We have seen time and time and time again this be successful. It may seem like a big undertaking to kind of change or maybe just integrate this process a little more fully than you have in the past, but it's not impossible. And this is the wave of the future. This is what the regulations, the regulatory agencies are looking for, and they take a look at this and they really like the way this flows and teaches them about the system as well. So don't be afraid, but make sure you prepare. I think those are my final thoughts.
And Michael, can you offer us any insight before we close? Actually, I can give you, there's one other question just came in, and it's probably more of a housekeeping question than anything. You said, you mentioned that we were having a part 2. Can you elaborate as to who we should contact for the next event?
Sure, not a problem. Yeah, we're going to be sending out invitations to everybody that we contacted before. We'll have somebody follow up with you directly to kind of get some feedback from the actual presentation and see if you'd be interested in following in the series of presentations we're going to be giving on just different topics. So we're absolutely going to be getting in contact with you. So just be on the lookout for some emails or phone calls to see if you'd be interested in the next one.
Okay, great. And actually, we have another question as well. So this is great. Question here is, as part of validation, what do you do differently between high-risk and low-risk process requirements?
Okay, so that is a really good question, and that is one that that our process kind of deals with directly, right? So anything that we identified within our process map, so the very first step, automatically is going to be considered a high, I don't want to call it high risk, but a high criticality function of our software, or a high criticality document, because it's protecting, it's preventing, or it's detecting one of those records that we identified in that process map. Okay, so all of those things will be considered of critical nature. Okay, so they will require challenge testing within the software validation portion of the project. Okay, now there's a lot of other functions out there which you're probably referring to here, and I'm not saying that you need to typically ignore them, but I want to kind of differentiate between our critical quality discussion in challenge testing, and then maybe what you can consider kind of a commissioning activity. So typically what we do is make sure that the implementation team goes through a series of tests to test all the types of what we consider non-critical functionality in whatever way they would like to. That can be a part of the validation team, but it's not necessarily a part of the validation, critical quality validation documentation. Everything that we discuss through this process would be considered critical, and you can have kind of a parallel path that would call it non-critical or less criticality. So it's not something that necessarily needs all the quality sign-offs and change control and change management and approvals and discrepancy resolution, all the things that you'll see within the actual validation train, if you will.
Okay, great. Thanks, Craig. I don't see any more questions that have come through.
We'll provide our attendees just a moment more to submit any questions. At this time, we really want to thank you, Craig, of course, and Michael for providing us this information today. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar, Implementing a Risk-Based Approach to Enterprise Software Validation. If you have any additional questions, please reach out to Meredith Thompson, Manager Business Development, and Meredith's phone number is 813-345-4441. Again, that's 813-345-4441, and you can reach her via email at meredith.thompson@csa-alliance.com. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you would complete that and provide us your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within the next 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. On behalf of CSA's Alliance and IQS and our presenters, we really want to thank you for joining us today, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Muted.